hopeful that it will come along. While you're recording me while I'm ducking down. I have a little space heater
Sorry,
on my feet
my
because
phone
it
did
gets,
something bad. I pressed a button.
huh? No,
I
that's
pressed a
okay.
button. Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
Um, well, um, um, a little housekeeping first. Um, how many of you, Rick is not here yet. Okay, I'm going to beat him up, but I'll see him soon. I'm sure he'll pop in. Um, if it was possible, if weather is permitting, especially Jamie and Devin, Pablo and Darla, no, of course not, because you and Herbie, you live out of town. But how many of the people here that live in town could come next Tuesday to the synagogue, weather permitting? Yes? Do we have a vote on this?
I'm a
Because
maybe.
maybe it's always dependent on the kids. All right,
Yeah.
but you're special. Um, I mean, you are special, but the main thing I'm concerned about is it's a heavy session on the Holocaust and Israel, and it'd be great to show a film right there and have at least the comfort of having somebody to hug, talk with. I see Sam and Emily. Oh, we're just doing the chat. So let me also go back over here to the. Don't save that. Okay. Let me go back over to the the website. I'm just talking to myself. Intro for tonight's class. So the recording is on.
I mute myself and it did that.
What's that?
I mute myself and it says it's recording you.
No,
It's weird.
you're muted anyway.
Oh,
Well,
okay,
no,
I'll see.
actually, you're not. You're
Okay, I
not
thought I
muted.
was doing
That's correct, but that's a very nice of you. Um,
it.
where is the okay intro class order? And going back to brief Jewish timeline, there we go. And the other one of Jewish civilization timeline, that's also helpful. Okay. And the material for tonight, modern. So I'll just open all those guys up. There they are. Okay. Is there anybody else I want to wait for? Rick's not here yet. That's all right. He'll show up when he shows up. And I don't know about Debbie either. Okay. The overall question to ask or to remember from our earlier sessions, the very first couple of sessions that we did, I apologize to Emily and oh no, I don't need that one. To Emily and Sam, but because we talked about this yesterday. Okay, here it is. This is not a class on history, but it's important that you understand some of the history because otherwise we'll tend to do what the Christians do and what some of the Chabad guys do and Orthodox Jews is say, God gave the Torah, everything's fine, there's no change, and we just have all this history, but everything is perfect, and the Torah is just interpreted. But if you look at it from the point of view of the civilization, the 5 stages of Jewish history, so I'm going to put that slide up from a few sessions back again, and then we're going to ask the question: when did the modern period begin? That's a good one. We'll come back to that one too. We'll come back to this. I'm just going through the slides. So this is the one I want. All right, so we'll share this screen. So the thesis is, and this is not radical at all. Hang on. Yeah, there it is. the thesis is that we're going through history, and you don't just wake up and say, hey, it's the Renaissance, everybody start painting. It's a scientific period, everybody start doing experiments. But rather, a crisis happens, and this is true of general history, world history too. And you are forced to evolve because of the way you need to survive. So I remember that we have BCE and CE. We're in CE now, of course, Common Era, otherwise known as AD. And you're looking at this screen, the stages of Jewish history. So the biblical period had Bible teachers, rabbis, not rabbis, prophets, the patriarchs, and Moses and the, hang on, I just got to get, this is the one I want. This is the one I want right here. Let me get a better one. Yeah, this is the one I want. All right, let's change that share. This is a better and easier to read one. Brief Jewish timeline. Do you see? No, it's the same one. Do you see the? Oh, I'll take it from here. No, that's the one. That's not the one I wanted. I want brief Jewish timeline. That's fine, but I want the other one because it's laid out a little bit better. Jewish civilization timeline. Okay, there we go. So we're living in two civilizations. We're always living in the general civilization that we are surrounded by, the Romans, the Greeks, the Spanish and Portuguese, the Germans, the Russians, and now American society. Each period has, I hope this is big enough, each period has leaders and authorities, and each period has conflicts, issues, survival, conflicts with the dominant civilization. Each period has its literary products. Let me get that just a little bit bigger even. And I think I can zoom it a little bit bigger than that. Zoom to 125. Is that good? All right. Nope, still I want it bigger than that even, 150. There we go. Okay. And so in the biblical period, not to go all the way back there, we have the patriarchs, Moses, the kings, the priests, the prophets, and we're, really in a lifestyle that we would think of as biblical times. That ends with the crisis of the destruction of the first temple, the exile to Babylonia, and the changing to survive, is saying maybe God is everywhere, maybe not just in our land, and our God is the God of the whole universe. And they come back to the land of Israel, they reestablish, they build a second temple, and this is called the rabbinic period. All right, I know this is review, but it's important to get these in your mind. In the rabbinic period, we have conflicts or living under the rule of the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, and then the end of the Roman Empire. So that's when each group, and I say this like every time, it's like a relay race. I pass on the traditions of the previous group. So the rabbis of the Greco-Roman period get to interpret what was given to them from the Bible. And that's how we get midrash, right? Commentaries. And they develop laws in the Mishnah. And they explain the laws in the Talmud. So that's the literary creation of the rabbinic periods, are those three. And then you could even argue that the New Testament is an invention of that period. So the literature. So what is the crisis that brings this to an end? Two crises, really, or maybe three. Destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 CE, and then again the destruction of the whole of Israel. They say 135 say you're all kicked out. And then even though we're kicked out, we still survive, but then Rome falls. Once Rome falls to all those marauding Europeans, the teachers and the Jews are left to themselves, and we begin what's now called the medieval period. During the Middle Ages, you could say a lot of horrible things happened, plagues, persecutions, being kicked out of different lands. But at the same time, the good things that happened was that's when the prayer books were being written, the Haggadah for Passover, the Kabbalah, poetry, philosophy, but it was a horrible time for the world, for people, Jews as well as serfs, and the rule of thumb in the Middle Ages was, basically, this is where God put you. You are not able to move. You are a serf, you are a Jew, you are a nobleman, and so what brings this to a close? Well, that's what we're going to learn about tonight. So the word enlightenment is often used to describe the things that changed in the 1700s. The rights of man, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and this idea that, I am a human being. And by the way, I said this initially, we forget that this period of time, kings and czars and rulers ruled. There was no democracy. Democracy is a very recent idea. I mean, the Greeks had it, but if you know something about the Greeks, it was democracy for the rich, and the rest of the people were, slaves or whatever. But the new ideas that came into play in the 1700s made a huge difference for the general society and slowly for the Jews. Rule of thumb is emancipation comes to the European communities, and then slowly, maybe 100 years later, to the Jews. So in this period, we begin we're calling it modern. And what is the break? When is the real break? Well, I hate to say it because it was a wonderful thing, but the French Revolution brought so many changes to the Jews of France and Germany, and that suddenly we were this group of people that European society, I hate to say it, we were the N-word of Europe. Where are the Jews? They live in the ghetto. What do they get to do? They can be money changers. They cannot own property. This is all in the Middle Ages. They are a despised group, or maybe there are a few rich Jews, the Rothschilds, the court Jews, they called them. And Napoleon, after the French Revolution, called together a group of rabbis that he had the chutzpah, the gall, to call the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was the name of the actual rabbinical court of the the rabbinical period. So he calls 100 rabbis together, and he sits them down. He says, I want to know, are you loyal citizens of the French Republic? Are you going to go back to the land of Israel whenever your Messiah comes? In other words, are you a fifth column? And they all answered 201, no, sir, we are loyal Frenchmen of the Mosaic persuasion. And that is what we're stuck with. And this is why I'm teaching this, so important to realize that's why in America, the same issues are still there. Are you loyal? I mean, yes, we're all Americans, but what you can hear today, I'm sorry to inject a little politics in it, but it's been going on for 200 or 300 years. Can't trust those black people. Can't trust those aliens. Can't trust those Chinese. At the end of the movie Blazing Saddles, there's a funny scene where they fought against the guys who want to take over the town of Rock Ridge, and there's this guy and the black slaves, or not slaves, but they're at this point they're railroad workers, want to help out, and so they ask this one guy. He says, "Well, okay, we'll make a deal with the black people, but no Irish." So that's what America. I'm going to change just for a minute here. America is part of that same culture. America and Europe all had this prejudice, but in America, and we will see that in America, things were going to be different. Back to France. So that same issue of loyalty was very big. This is the period in which all of this from 1700s to 1950, it's a long period, is when we see all these revolutions, the French, the American, and finally the Russian, 1917. That's also the period in which people begin to question and change politics. I talked yesterday with you guys about Fiddler on the Roof, and I'll mention that in a minute. This is also a huge period of people wanting to move out of the oppressive societies. Russia, Poland, German Jews begin to move to America or wherever they can go. And this period ends, we will see it next week, with the horrible persecutions of the Holocaust, but it was already, the roots of it were already there. Because this is also the period when anti-Semitism arose in Germany and France and elsewhere. So that's the general rule of thumb, folks. You have a crisis, and people say, we got to change. So how did we change? For the better, we were told, okay, no more ghettos. You don't have to live separate, but we don't really want to accept them. All right, let me step the share for a second. So let's look at Moses Mendelssohn. I know this may be a review for some of you guys from yesterday. Herb, how are you?
Hey, Rap. How's it
All
going?
right, man. So Herb, as you know, is in L.A. and grew up in El Salvador. And some of this is relevant, and Pablo is also Puerto Rican. Some of this has parallels for the Latin American experience. So Moses Mendelssohn was I got to hit the screen share again. You see a picture there. Now, I want to show the video. Maybe I will, but I want to just firstly. So he was not an exceptionally beautiful man, short, stocky. He had health problems, but brilliant, absolutely brilliant. They used to say, from Moses to Moses, there is none like Moses. And they were referring to, do you all see that one? I've got a lot of things up on the screens. So they were referring to Moses Maimonides from Spain, because he also translated, he wrote in Arabic, he wrote about the Torah. This Moses was a different Moses. He's born into a poor family, but he was brilliant. He studied, and he had teachers that were exceptional. And he went to work in the field of textile, so he had a living. He also was one of the first people to actually take his father's name, not in the way that we do it. The Hebrew way would be Moshe ben Mendel. But he actually, it wasn't his idea, but to be Germanized, it was Mendelssohn. So that's how we get things like Edelson, or what's another son? I can't think of one right this top of my head.
Peterson.
Huh?
Peterson.
Well, Peterson would be the English version of that, yes. Also, by the way, since we're talking about last names, when Germany, a section of Germany was, a section of Poland was annexed into Germany, and then later went back to Poland. But in the meantime, they said, what are we going to do with all these Jews? Let's give them last names. So you're dark. We're going to call you Schwartz. You come from, we're going to make up names. You come from the high area, so we're going to call you Berg, which means mountain. You're lighter skin, we'll call you Weiss. So that's how we got all those names. Or also another way would be an occupation. So, and this is true of Hispanic names too. Pablo Castro, right, is a tailor. So how we all got our name? My last name is an occupation name. It means somebody who deals with your money, or not a biker. All right, so
mine was a shepherd. Varela means
Varela?
like a long
cool.
stick. Shepherd.
All right,
Yeah.
all right. So, and this is true of Armenian names, Irish names too. All right, so, but Mendelssohn became a very accomplished teacher in his period. And what he did was, he said the German Jews need to be educated, and they are too stuck and sheltered. And how will we do that? Well, they all read the Torah. So I will make a translation of the Torah, of the Bible, into German. Two reasons. One, just like with the Greek translation, one reason was get those Jews to stop speaking this pidgin German, right? The guttural, the low German of Yiddish, and teach them German. And at the same time, let the German people see, oh, we're not savages, we're civilized. So he accomplished that goal. And so when I was a kid, we had a history book, from the Reform movement, and it pictured these ghetto walls. What, you remember what it was a ghetto? It was literally a walled-in city. And you could only leave the ghetto with a funny hat or a Jewish star or a circle or something and you would be allowed to leave to go to work. You had to be back by sundown or curfew. So the picture I remember as a kid was that Mendelssohn broke down the walls. Well, he didn't literally do it. The French did. But all of Germany, France, suddenly this opening up of the doors. And Mendelssohn was considered, keep on getting a dry throat, so I'm going to turn my heater off. Mendelssohn, again, a little bit of a parallel to America. You're a good black. You're cultured, You're a good Latino, So he was educated. So there was a man named Isaac Leeser who wrote a book called Isaac the Wise, and he modeled it on Mendelssohn. Well, here's the rub, and you can read that article. And again, I don't say this to be critical, but just to point out, typically the traditional Jews, they were not called Orthodox, so I'll get to that, but traditional Jews would say, aha, see what happens? So you get educated and you go learn the ways of the world. And so Fanny Mendelssohn, one of his daughters, started, a lot of other women did it as well. There's an article here I have about women's salons. The salons, just like today, or women of the 60s, come on over to Susie's house. We're going to have a consciousness raising groups or something. So they would invite, the richer Jewish women would invite scholars. Maybe there were Jewish scholars. Maybe there were German or learned men. And the women would be the leaders, in a sense, of this wave of, I don't want to call it assimilation, but opening the doors to the outside world. Well, guess who is Moses Mendelssohn's grandson? Felix Mendelssohn. So Moses to Fanny to Felix. Felix Mendelssohn, the great composer, converted to Christianity, as did Karl Marx in Russia, Heinrich Heine also in Germany, and Franz Kafka did not convert, but he was Czechoslovakian. But the typical thing, if you wanted, I can't explain it any other way. And this is different for black people or Latinos or people of color, but if you wanted to fit in, what was the only way to do it? Join them. So Jews would sometimes, I hate to say it, would become Christian, would convert in order to get out of that life. They would not be accepted, but you'd be surprised. Sometimes some of you have even told me, or people I run into from German backgrounds have sometimes told me, and you hear this, of course, with people from Spain, but people have told me that they found out that their distant grandparents who came over from Germany had done this. So suddenly, now, with the ghetto walls breaking down, this is where things get good and bad. The good is, it wasn't overnight. You can't suddenly go to university, but you can find a way to make a living in the outside world. It's not cloistered anymore. And that's a weird word because cloistered comes from usually talk about nuns, but we were integrated into society a little bit. So then, as you all know, Jews began to look around. They say, hey, look at that church. It's so beautiful with that steeple. My friend Hans tells me that they have a sermon in German and they get to sit with their wives and they have a choir. And what about our shul? You know, it looks ugly. The rabbi speaks Yiddish. So they wanted, again, I don't want to just call it assimilation, but that's what it was. They wanted to fit in. So why can't we have a choir, mixed seating? And that was the beginnings of what, I'll get to this a little later, the Reform movement, or the Reformers, as they were called. And so, Taylor, you think so? Oh, you found that out with your family?
Yeah,
You want to jump in?
researching family
Yes.
history. It was weird because it was on like it's 5 of my 8 great grandparents on my mom's side all had Jewish ancestors. And they were like
Wow.
in synagogue records, and then you keep going, and then all of a sudden you get to more modern period and they're all of a sudden not. It's like, what happened?
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, because by the next generation, they could say, oh, I don't need that. I mean, and also for that period, it was, we didn't have the kind of joy. Well, it was joyful, but it was a burden. It was hard. And like I said, I mean, we don't even have to go that far back. So they could look at the 50s. People, straightening their hair and changing their names. And yes, I'm Jewish. So what? So yeah. So, but in those times, again, with the oppression and with the consciousness of being a second-class citizen, why bother? As I said, Heinrich Heine is a good example. So is Karl Marx. All right. So,
were there forced conversions back then too?
not in that period. I mean,
Okay.
not in the that mindset did not belong to the modern period. Yes, it was part of the medieval period. That's a fascinating question. So that's what I'm getting at. Okay, I'm going to play this just scenario. When I was working at summer camp, well, I'm really aging myself here. They used to have a game that they would do at psychology groups, and it was called a trust circle. And there were 2 versions of it. One trust circle was a group of people, friends of yours, you get a bunch of campers, hi kids, and they all stand around, and there's one person in the middle, and they close their eyes, and they say, okay, now allow yourself to fall. And the other people around them are supposed to catch them. Of course, if somebody either doesn't or I can't, I don't trust you. So that was called a trust circle. And the other version was to feel what it feels like to be on the outside is, okay, now we're all in a circle, and you, Bob or Susie, you're outside the circle, and you want to get into the clique, right? And you just go around, I'll give you $1, I'll give you $5, I'll be your best friend, or they try to force their way in, and the people in the circle are given instructions, don't let that person in. So you can imagine that's about racism or sexism, or you're not good at athletics, whatever it is. Well, apply that. That's what I used to do. And I would say, no, let's apply that to the Jewish model. The ghettos, the shtetls, or if you will, the pueblos. I'm not going to try to translate it to another culture, but the way that certain ethnic groups behave is very loving, protective, supportive. If somebody's poor, we take care of them. If there's a guy in the street begging, he's a Jew, he can sleep on the floor of the synagogue and come to my house. Here's a needle, yeshiva guys would go to a town and they had called it eating days. And you go to the Schlivovitz's house on Monday and the Boinstein's house on Tuesday, and so every night they would get a place to sleep and eat. So that's the positive. So there was a book that was written in the 70s, called 60s, called Life is with People. And it was all the wonderful things about what life was like in the old country. The good things. The bad thing was, like I said, you could not exit into, this is the Middle Ages, you could not, the only way in that door was become a Christian. And even then, as we know from Spain, you were always suspect. Maybe the next generation, your kids, so Felix Mendelssohn, as I'm getting as an example, the Nazis would never play his music because they still said, I don't care that he converted and became a Christian. He is still a Jew, period. That was what they did. All right. So the next feature about the modern period that's really crucial to understand is, I said, now it's a choice, but it's really not a choice. So again, another parallel. I don't want to do anti-Semitism just yet, but just a parallel to the American experience after the Civil War, 1863. I'm a history buff, as you all know by now. Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Really, frankly, aside from the fact that he was assassinated, Ulysses S. Grant, really pushed after the war the Reconstruction and the desegregation of the South. Maybe shoved it down their throats a little bit too much, but the counter reaction, especially in the South, was why we saw the growth of the Ku Klux Klan and the Jim Crow laws and the anti-black prejudice, which then continued all the way up into the 1950s. So you want to tell us that they're equal, but they're separate but equal. There even was a Supreme Court case called Plessy v. Ferguson in, I want to say, 1919. Oh, and the wonderful President Woodrow Wilson was also quite a racist, as was Theodore Roosevelt. But not Roosevelt was about the Filipinos, but Woodrow Wilson, they just did not accept blacks as equal. So I'm going to get to it a little bit more in a minute, but this push, this sudden swelling of Jews in France and Germany in particular, somewhat in England, but not in Russia. That's, again, we'll get to that in a minute also. The further east you go, the more backward or the more resistance there is to this thrust towards modernity. So equal, but not really equal. Liberty, your members, you're now citizens, but we don't trust you. And so let me cover briefly the, I'll get to the movements next, but let me briefly cover why next week's lesson on the horrible things of the 20th century are so important, but their roots are in this period. Again, good question before, Taylor. Or I'll ask this question: how did Christians hate the Jews? What were the ways that Christians were educated to hate the Jews in the Middle Ages? We're not going into the 19th century. What were they taught? I mean, I don't want to offend anybody.
Blaming him for plagues, killing children,
and killing our Lord, right?
Yeah.
So so all
they still teach that.
There's still some.
Yeah.
Right. Vatican II in 1965, I want to say, said no, we don't believe that anymore, but it's still taught in some places. Mm-hmm. Or at least they can't ignore the fact that it's in the scriptures that way. In what is that? Acts, Luke. But in any event, there are different kinds. Pardon?
Oh.
Okay. Who said?
She said for killing Christ. That was a question.
Yeah. So religious anti-Semitism is a specific. I mean, it's all anti-Semitism. We don't need an excuse to hate you. We just hate you. But the anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages, and that goes all the way back, by the way, to the Greeks, right? We don't like you because you guys are different. We want everybody to be the same. That was the Greeks and the Romans. And you guys are just weird, but we can tolerate you. But the Middle Ages, that became very, very virulent in the ways that Taylor described. The blood libels, the blaming him for the plagues, also the money, the financial issues. If you can't have a real job or really own, you can have a job in your community. You're a tailor, you're a butcher, you sell wine, you run a tavern, but you can't own property. You are not part of the society. So this is a horrible story, as I know you most of you know, is that the Bible says, the Torah even says, you shall not lend money with interest, okay, to a fellow Jew. It was the way the rabbis interpreted it. So you all know the story. I don't want to go back to the Middle Ages, but you all know about two characters, one in Shakespeare, The Merchant of Venice, and the other in Oliver Twist, right? Of Fagin, right? When I was a kid, I saw Oliver. I'm reviewing the situation, it's this guy who's this, he's not a moneylender, he's a crook. He sends these boys out to rob the kids, and he is portrayed as a sinister Jew. So those were the occupations, that Jews were moneylenders. Well, guess what? Again, I didn't want to get into the Middle Ages. One of the things that we find is, in order to have all the explorations and the ships and industries growing, they would turn to somebody, because there wasn't banks that we didn't have like we do today. They would turn to somebody to lend the money. So they used the Jews to lend money, and they hated the Jews because of the way this works. So that's how the Merchant of Venice plays into it. And they're very, very sinister characters. The reality is that there were many different kinds of people that lent money, including Christians. But that's a very sad story. Now, what is different? Okay, so even within this period, there was religious anti-Semitism, and another thing that I'm alluding to, economic anti-Semitism. We don't want them to be in our guild that we run, so we will keep them out. And their competition. So that was why Jews were kicked out of Poland to go to Russia, Germany to go to Poland, and even England kicked the Jews out. And then Oliver Cromwell eventually invited them back in the early 1700s. So that's economic. Then there's social anti-Semitism. Now, we still have that to some extent, but did you all know, you all live here, those who live in here in Cheyenne, but I lived in L.A. In L.A., Orange County, where Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm is, in the days I was a kid, the Jews were not welcome there. Now they're all over the place, as are the Koreans and the Filipinos. But and here in Cheyenne, the area south of Pershing was off limits. You couldn't. They had the I don't remember what the name of the laws was. It was a law or something like that. You couldn't sell to a Jew. Of course, now.
Seriously?
Yes.
Oh my gosh! I believe it, but
ask Jeff.
Wow.
Ask Jeff about that. Ask Jeff Weinstein.
They couldn't own property in the avenues here in Cheyenne.
No, in the avenues. I'm not saying they couldn't own, but it was what was it called, Stephanie? I want to call it principal laws or something. But it was a norm, that real estate agents look in L.A. As far as blacks were concerned, they had redlining. So there were properties that were owned by people there were black folks that owned properties, and it still goes on. Racism has been a part of every society. Back to this issue. So what begins to happen is, as the Jews find ways to, at least in the West, they find ways to fit in, the anti-Jewish feeling takes a new form. I will cover this. And there's a guy named Wilhelm Marr, not to be confused with Bill Maher, the comedian, who does not have Jewish background, but he talks about it a lot. Wilhelm Marr wrote the first book on anti-Semitism, and it was a new term. Because remember I say, religious, we don't like them because of this, they didn't accept our Lord, or they killed him, or whatever, or economic or social. This one just says they are evil. Our society cannot assimilate these people. And there began to be, I got to go to America now, racial. We talked about this the very first session. They had, this is gross, they had studies that were made, and you have to look at the some of the books and the films to see this, caricatures of Jews with big noses and curly hair and dark, just like anti-black images, and with money, So that was when the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was written. And guess who in America? It's a book. It's a horrible, false book that says the Jews are in charge of things, and they have these secret societies. And guess who promoted that book in America? Who made sure it was published in America in English? Give you a hint. Car. A famous car. Henry Ford. Henry Ford was a notorious anti-Semite. I'm not saying don't buy a Ford. Don't buy a Tesla. So Wilhelm Marr's thesis was this idea that the new term was not, we don't hate Jews, we hate Semites. And going back to America, this was also what happened as far as American black African Americans. Somehow, if you say they are inferior, their brains, their all kinds of gross biological examinations. So this was the beginning of what we now call racial anti-Semitism. And that was where the Nazis picked up the idea. So I don't want to get into this too much because we'll talk about more next week, but in some ways, the earlier anti-Semitism was always there under the surface. We will talk more about this with Russia, but let's go east for just a second. In the Russian experience, how many of you saw Fiddler on the Roof? It's a cute movie. So several things you see in that movie. One thing, I don't want to do anti-Semitism. Let's go back to the 5 daughters. Tevye has 5 daughters, right? One is the youngest one, so she's still with mom and dad. The one daughter, they say, we have a match for you. He's the butcher. He's an ugly guy, but he's got a lot of money. And she says, no, I'm in love with Muttel the tailor. So the first rebellion of the women is love, right? Not a match, love. Oh, my God, what a shame, what a shame. Second daughter marries or runs away with the communist. I can't remember his name, but he's played by Paul Michael Glaser of Starsky and Hutch fame. My version, the 70s version. And anyway, so he is a Jewish anarchist, socialist, and he joins the revolution, and he gets thrown in jail, I believe. The third daughter really rebels and marries and runs away with a Russian guy. So this is the beginning of this change, the challenge to the old ways, the traditions. There was a fourth daughter. I don't remember what happens to the fourth, but Tevye is lying in bed with his wife and saying, "Oi, what am I supposed to do?" But there's another scene in the movie, which was, of course, very subdued. They're having a wedding, a beautiful wedding, and the Cossacks attack. So again, this is more for next week, but anti-Semitism continued in all throughout France and Germany and Russia. But in the Russian experience, people would get drunk on Easter and then would go have a riot, right? Because they were told, somebody just said before, they were told, what, Pershing? was the name of what, Herb? What, Herb? The other guy. What other guy? Oh, Pershing in America? Talk to us, Herb. Oh, the communist. Oh, Perchik. You're right, Perchik. Not Pershing. I'm thinking Pershing. Pershing is a street here in. Yes, Perchik is the communist.
Sorry, it was the corrector.
the darn auto check, yeah, auto spell. Yes. So Muttel the tailor, Perchik the communist. But now I want to talk for a minute. It's in the articles there. I want to talk for a minute about this enlightenment that we talked about. All right. So the term in Hebrew is Haskalah. Haskalah, it's a Hebrew word, means to enlightenment. So it could mean all kinds of things. God didn't write the Torah. Maybe the Torah was written by men. Maybe a science. All these kinds of questioning things. This was all part of the Christian world too. Suddenly, my God, Galileo. Going back to that period, Galileo was tried and excommunicated for proposing that the sun did not revolve around the earth. Come on. So the Haskalah brings all those changes. For the Jews, like I said, 100 years maybe later than the rest of the world. In the West, this is in an article I have here, in the Western Haskalah, that is France and Germany particularly, the question was, how do we adapt, is the right word. I'm not going to say assimilate, but that's what it is, but how can we still be Jewish and be accepted? So let's change the way we dress. Let's change the way we speak. Let's have our services be more dignified. And so this was the trend. In the East, that is particularly in Russia, Hungary, Galicia, it was a different kind of enlightenment or awakening. And I would say it, again, bad parallel, but comparing some American blacks to, let's say, Dr. King or Malcolm X. The Eastern Haskalah would say, we are a people just like they are a people. We deserve our own homeland. And this was the beginnings of the Zionist movement. And so the Eastern Jews they pushed Hebrew over Yiddish. They pushed Jewish nationalism. Some said, well, let's go have a homeland somewhere else. Maybe there was a group of people who wanted to go to Birobidzhan, and a group of people wanted to go to Uganda. But eventually that group ended up saying, no, Israel is the place. So those are the small differences between the East and the West. As I said, in Russia, somebody said, was it Sam? You said that your grandparents or great-grandparents were afraid of being drafted. In Russia, they would go into villages and not just draft, but grab kids at 12 or 13 and throw them into the army, and they would be serving in the army for 5 years, 10 years, whatever, and they would come out no longer Jews, or at least no longer aware of their Jewishness, or completely Russified. So the Russian experience was extremely harsh. Catherine the Great of Russia, when Russia annexed part of Poland, they said, what are we going to do with all these Jews? Well, 1/3 will die of starvation or oppression or the army. 1/3 will convert, and 1/3 will leave, eventually. So she got her wish. So some of them leave. That's what you see in Fiddler. By the way, you know that Fiddler is based on the stories, not stories, but the stories of the people written by Sholem Aleichem, a great Yiddish writer of the time. So that's why Fiddler was so popular in the 1960s when American Jews were like coming of age. Oh, wow, let's. So they didn't want, no, people did not want to read Sholem Aleichem. I've read Sholem Aleichem in English and Yiddish, and I suggest you look them up. Now, another thing about the Haskalah that is crucial that I didn't cover with you guys yesterday, it was Sam and Emily over there, and Pablo and Darla over there. I mentioned Yiddish and Hebrew. So for the first time, and Hebrew, I'm saying, for the first time, this period brings with it a self-awareness. Even in general society, books, stories, people would tell stories, Grimm's fairy tales and the Andersons fairy tales and all this. But so Jewish authors began to write short stories, and the Yiddishists began to write their stories. There was in the earlier period, in the Middle Ages, there was a thing, it was called Sena Reina. I'm not going to, well, I guess already. Sena Reina meant, Sena Reina meant, go out and see. That Sena Reina stories were stories written, popular stories for women in Yiddish, because what happened, you probably can imagine this, the men knew Hebrew in the synagogue, and they would speak Yiddish in the streets, but the women told the stories, and the women passed on a lot of the literature of the time. So there were Sena Reina stories, there were also, there's a lot to get into, but there was a wonderful thing that would be, when a woman was lighting candles on Shabbat, they had little Yiddish poems and sayings that she could say in Yiddish as she's lighting the candles. Gott von Himmel, hast du, I can't do it in Yiddish. Would you please protect my children and my husband and our dog, and our dogs they didn't like, but our cow, so and God bless this home. So there was literature, but for the first time in this period, we start to see the emergence of people writing about their lives. So briefly, I can't do it, it's way beyond this class, but Shalom Aleichem, Sholem Ash, who wrote the book called The Dybbuk. The Dybbuk, if you remember, is a story of a guy taken over by his girlfriend or his fiance dies, and he's so upset he consults the Kabbalah and he prays and he does all this weird stuff, and her soul comes back, but to haunt him, So the Dybbuk was a possession. So you want to know where, what was the movie about the possession in the 70s?
The Exorcist.
The Exorcist, all right. So The Exorcist is based on this Jewish possession. Also, the Golem. The Golem story is about another Kabbalist, clay monster. So this is all from the earlier period. But now what happens is instead of, so Sholem Ash took the Dybbuk stories and turned it into a play. And the play was done in Europe and then in the Lower East Side. This is already next week somewhat. So the people began to go to see these plays. So that's when the Yiddish writers began to write their beautiful stories. Another famous writer is Peretz, and each of them were slightly different. Isaac Leib Peretz wrote kind of socialist, kind of moral tales. I'm getting into too much detail, but I love this stuff. I study this literature. Peretz has a story called Bunch of Schweig, Bunch of the Silent. And in this story is a noble guy, a poor guy who never complains about life, and he dies and goes to heaven, and the angels are surrounding him, and he says, they say, tell us great things, you are such a good man. And he says, he's so stupid. He says, I want I should have a little glass of water or a little glass of tea. And they say, wait a minute, you could ask for the whole world to be healed. All you want is a glass of tea, because he was Bunch of the Silent. So they wrote stories about working men, and that's why I say the stories of Sholem Aleichem are important. On the other side, slowly but surely, Hebrew begins to be a revived language. And so let's go back to I want to do the film, but I don't think we will. You just got to watch the film on your own. What do you know about Zionism, folks? Where did it come from? Where does this idea come from? Come on, a dream. What was a dream?
Is it I mean, they kind of base it on the Bible originally,
Okay.
right?
Correct.
And then
And
the
go ahead.
Holocaust.
Well, before that, it's long before that, but there's a feeling. Let me see if I can go back to the slide here. Watch the film. Watch the number 4. Maybe I don't. I want to see the movies, but I think it's just more important. I don't want to lecture you, but yes, Taylor, you're right. It begins with the prayers, the religious side, the way that people talked. At the Passover Seder, we say, next year in Jerusalem. That was what they said throughout the centuries. Sam, growing up, all this kind of talk in the prayer book about the Holy Land, and we pray, So there was this.
Isn't Zion a Soprano place?
Zion, okay, good. Zion is the mountain, Sion, Mount Sion. By the way, the Z is a tzadi. So it's in Hebrew.
Yeah, Sion.
Sion,
TZ,
Sion, right. But in English, it's Zion. Okay, so Mount Zion is both. Mr. Zion is correcting me. Mount Zion is the central main mountain. It's not a mountain. It's really just a little mound in Jerusalem. Okay, and Zion is also the name for the land of Israel. Okay, so again, there's a difference between medieval anti-Semitism and modern anti-Semitism. The same way, there's a difference between, someday the Messiah will come and bring us back to the Holy Land. Remember we talked about that Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah.
The false Messiah, yeah.
He goes to the Sultan of Turkey in the 1600s and says, I am the Messiah. Give us back the land of Israel. And the Sultan says, yeah, right, I'll stab you unless you convert. And he says, okay, I'll convert. And then we talked about the mystics of Tzfat who prayed, and we did that last week at the Seder, at the Tu B'Shvat event. So modern Zionism begins, I can't get into this in great length, but you remember, some of you know a little of this history. Germany, remember there weren't even nation states in the Middle Ages. I mean, there were states in places, there were kingdoms, the Holy Roman Empire and the Gauls and the Franks and so on. But slowly they evolve, and they have a ruler, and Bismarck was the first to do this for Germany. So by the late 1800s, people begin to say, wait, maybe we're the Serbs, we're the this, we're the that. We need our own country. So France has its, Germany has its. By the way, you may remember what started World War I. One of the things was imperialism, but also there was a revolt in Serbia against the Austrians, I believe. And so this was the thrust. So people always say, Theodor Herzl, let me go to that slide, Modern Jewish Timeline. Okay, got it? Yeah, maybe that'll be okay. Okay, so in there is Herzl. Okay. So the main thing you need to hear or know is Herzl, Theodor Herzl. But I want to go back before him, and there were two other guys. One is not mentioned on this time. Look at the bottom of the page. Just a few quick things. 1789, the French Revolution, right? 1790s, the French Jews are given citizenship, but with that little deal, as long as you just make it, denationalized, just be Frenchmen of the Mosaic persuasion. In the 1840s, the beginnings of the reform movement in Germany. In 1870, the ghettos were abolished in Italy. Remember, the first ghetto was established in Italy in 1516. So there were huge pogroms. What is a pogrom? A government-sponsored riot, right? Or maybe eventually, like in Fiddler, it was, oh, let's get drunk and go attack the Jews. But by the 1880s, this is no different than what Trump is doing, folks. Not riots, but by the 1880s, the Tsar Alexander the Second, right? I believe it's Alexander the First, then Nicholas, and then Alexander the Second, or maybe it was the third, was assassinated. They blamed it on a Jew, and they pushed this idea to get the masses to arise, and there were huge pogroms all over Russia. So Leo Pinsker was a Russian Jew who published a book called Auto-Emancipation, and he deserves the title of the founder of modern Jewish nationalism. He did not necessarily say, let's all get on a boat and go to Israel, but as a result of his writings, 1881, there were the beginnings of some Jews leaving, and also some Jews, the first groups of Jews began to, new groups of Jews began to migrate to Israel. There was even another guy, Moses Hess, in 1845, wrote another book called Rome and Jerusalem in Germany. So think about it. But the one who was given the most credit, perhaps, and rightfully so, Theodor Herzl, is highly assimilated. When I say highly assimilated, I mean really assimilated, Austrian Jew. You've heard about him. He looked like, with a full beard. He wasn't religious, but he had a nice, good, bushy beard, so he looked like a Moses, right? And he is a journalist. And in the 1880s, there was the Franco-Prussian War. I'm giving you quick dates because I'm not going to give every exact date. So the French and the Germans, Franco-Prussian War, and the generals needed somebody to blame for losing the war. So they pointed to a Lieutenant Alfred Dreyfus. And it was a horrible event called the Dreyfus Affair. There is a movie about it in America. It was, what was it called? Not The Affair, but anyway, it's Émile Zola, not a Jew. Émile Zola was a French writer, and he published a book about this, and he put articles in the journals, just like somebody would say, Black Lives Matter, but he was a Frenchman, and he said, J'accuse, I accuse the French generals of doing this. But what they did is, it got to the point where people were chanting at the trial for Alfred Dreyfus, kill the Jew, kill the Jew, kill the Jew. So who is there covering this but Theodor Herzl? So he goes back to Austria and he, files his article, but then he writes Der Judenstaat. And in it, he says, he proposes, it's sort of like a utopia. Again, I have to bring in my American stuff. In America, it was very common at that time to publish books that were like looking forward to the great future we have. There was Edward Bellamy wrote a book called Looking Backward. Here we are in the 1920s, and look how we all have electric cars, and flying cars, and also, or Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. So it wasn't science fiction, but he wrote a book, and here we are in the Holy Land, and look how happy the Arabs are. Look how happy the Jews are. We're all living in peace. It was very naive, but it was still a beautiful book. I have a copy in English translation. So Herzl convenes, or people convened, the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. And that Congress, that's when I said the Russians rebelled against the Germans and the French, and they said, we'll go anywhere. We'll go anywhere. Maybe we can go to Uganda. And the Russians said, no, only Israel. So it was like a big push. And that was how the modern Zionist movement was founded. By that period, this is overlapping things. By that period, we already had, let me do the movements. Maybe we'll end with that. By that time, we had the beginnings of the different movements. And where did it go? Okay. And oh, it's over here. This is a good place to end, or not end, but where did the modern movements come from that we call reform and conservative and so on? Nope, that's not the one I want either. Oh, here, I have both here. Okay. It's on both. It's on two sides. Let me get out of my AOL. And so this is review for somewhat for Emily and Sam, but it's good for us to all get it together. I have it right here. Why isn't it showing up? Docs? No. Okay. I got it. Okay. Share screen. I have got to learn this program better. Screens. Oh, there it is. It's under screen. Okay. So as I was saying earlier on, so imagine a very nice Jewish family in Berlin. The first modern Jewish synagogue was founded in Berlin, and in the 1830s, and they're waking up from this long sleep, and they look. I said before, they look around and say, "Hey, Hans tells me they have a sermon in German." And they don't go to church, believe me, they wouldn't dare step foot in a church, but they hear about it. And so they start to say, wouldn't it be nice if we could sit with our families? Or wouldn't it be nice if we'd have a mixed choir? They had choirs, but it was all men. So the beginnings of this movement, which was not called reform, but whatever the word would be in German, reformers. So these liberal synagogues began to spring up all over Germany, and so the irony is, for your benefit, is to understand that the movements go in this order. Now, not Sephardi and Mizrahi, because that was continuing all the way through, but the rebellion against traditional Judaism happened first, and then, as a counterbalance to that, counter argument to that, a bunch of other Jews, also in Germany, Shamson Raphael Hirsch was a brilliant Orthodox theologian, and he had a dapper beard. He did not look like a chassid. He spoke German, and they started the movement of what we now call Orthodox. Their motto was, be a Jew in your home, but be a mensch on the street. Dress, nice, speak German, be passable. In other words, maybe that's a good term to put it. Be passable. But still keep the laws. So they developed what were, for that time, was pretty revolutionary. The idea, now men and women still sat separately. They kept all the laws. They kept all the kashrut, but their services would be maybe a little shorter. So when you go to a modern Orthodox synagogue today in Denver, Philadelphia, LA, New York, that's what you're seeing. And they still spoke a Yiddish kind of Hebrew. Meanwhile, in the East, the Hasidic movement was growing, which we learned about 3 weeks ago. And they did not want to change. And also they added the element of the Rebbe. Okay, so along came in the 1870s a third group, which we now call conservative, but they called it positive historical Judaism. Or sometimes the German term was Die Wissenschaft des Judentums. I don't know German, but it means the historical study of Judaism. So this group said, you're both wrong. You reformers have gone too far, and you Orthodox are not wanting to change. We will have a shorter service, Initially, men and women did not sit together. The rabbi would be a dignified rabbi, and they were close to the Orthodox, but they made minor changes. So that movement came to be known in America as conservative. It doesn't mean it means they conserve. Jumping ahead, both the Orthodox moved to America too, but when the reformers from Germany came over, you all remember Levi Strauss, the guy who made the jeans for the gold miners and people like that. So the merchants that came over, my grandparents on my mother's side, my great grandparents were Hungarian, but they were merchants. And my mother even kept a little document that this guy wrote to his loved ones back in Austria. They're Austro-Hungarian, so there's not too much division. And he wrote it in fluent English. Dear my beloved wife. So for those people who came over, the first Reformed synagogues were founded in New Amsterdam, New York, Florida, North Carolina, remember, and in Cincinnati, they started a seminary, watching the time, and this was where they ordained their first rabbis. And okay, Sam, will you tell them the story of the Treifa banquet, or Sam and Emily, because maybe I stopped talking for a minute.
They served shrimp. Yeah,
at the ordination ceremony.
Yeah,
and so the word got out to the Jewish press of the United States, and they called it the Treifa banquet. So it was a shanda. But the interesting thing is, again, there's an ethnic component to this. So, not totally, but at least in that time, if you were a German or an Austrian Western Jew and you came to America, the first thing you did was join a large Reformed style synagogue, maybe on the Upper West Side. If you were a Russian or maybe East German, or maybe there wasn't an East Germany, or maybe just further east, or Hungarian, you would join a modern Orthodox shul. The backbone of the backbone of the conservative movement in the 1920s and 30s was second generation Jewish kids whose parents had been Orthodox. And so that's why the conservative movement today still struggles with the issue. Now we get to the halakha question. Who decides what the law is? For the Orthodox, there's no question, right? It's binding, it's immutable. Maybe there's changes over time. The rabbis make the decision. For the Hasidic, also, it's binding at all times, but the Rebbes might make some changes. And there's also mystical reasons, right? So Hasidic is a subset of Orthodox. I know you guys knew that, but for conservative, or for this mid-group, and it was not large until maybe the 50s, but in the 30s, there were rabbis who would rule on things. So by 1952, I believe, 55, the law committee, it's called the Rabbinical Assembly Law Committee, and they had to make decisions. People did not live in the cities anymore, or they had moved out to the suburbs. How do you get to shul? What's the answer? You can drive your car, but only to and fro. You can't stop for a blintz or cheesecake. You can't spend money. So that was what the law committee did. Today, even so, the law committee of the conservative movement still says halakha, Jewish law, is binding, but we make changes. I told you all yesterday about my friend Leslie Alexander. Went to college together. Leslie's dad was a rabbi. She wanted to be a conservative rabbi. The RA, or the JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, was not ordaining women rabbis in 77 probably. So she went to the Reform Movement Seminary, and when she left, she worked for a few years in the Reform Movement, and she left and joined the conservative movement. And so that's her mindset. In Israel, I went to visit my friend Reuven, who's an Israeli guy, and I talked to a Jew from South Africa, and I'm curious, as I think about it from time to time, and this guy, the president of the shul, says, in Israel, they don't allow conservative rabbis to be as liberal as they do in America. There's no instrumental music in conservative synagogues in Israel. How many of you have been to, Sam has been to his synagogue growing up, but if you go to and Pablo and Darla have been attending a Reform one, Herb, you've been all over the place. I don't want to go right to the present day, but these movements are both important and also becoming, what's the word that we use? Fluid, like say gender fluid. Reform used to be very classical reform. The choir, the robes, the organ, don't wear a yarmulke, we don't keep kosher, and now that has changed, and they're bringing back things just because it's nice. We like to. So the old style was called classical reform. I don't want to say it was like Protestant, but it was very churchy. That's what I grew up with. Around 1970, the younger rabbis started playing guitars, and we started having Peter, Paul, and Mary services, and they gave it, the kids got to lead, oh yeah, we're going to have a different service. And the old folks would sit there and say, it's not what I remember, but look at all these people. So that has changed. There are very few, there are a few classical reform synagogues left in San Francisco, New York. I mentioned the Carolinas, and they'll still have, different styles of services. The conservative has changed. So you could go to a conservative synagogue, and it would be very common. The Hebrew's going to be there. Stylistically, it's very Hebraic, right? But also, our synagogue is a good example. It was conservative, never affiliated, but it was still, the style was more Hebrew. And eventually they said, they use the term frontier Judaism, all right? So the women's role has changed historically. The conservative movement, back to Leslie, the conservative movement wouldn't ordain women, nor gays, nor trans, and they wouldn't, you just had to hide if you were gay. Nowadays, there are at least 3 trans conservative rabbis I know of, but guess what? You can be thrown out of the conservative movement. If you're a rabbi and you do an intermarriage, they will kick you out. A gay marriage, okay. But not a gay marriage where it's intermarriage, because that's like the line they won't cross. Okay, so you need to, when you're looking around at synagogues, you have to say, is this a traditional conservative synagogue, or is it a more innovative conservative synagogue? I mentioned yesterday, my friend Mike Stein is a cantor. He's retired now in LA, and he was the cantor in Canoga Park. And because he had such a great background, the rabbi would let him, every other month, he got to do a not creative, but he got to do a more musical service. He did a bluegrass service, a jazz service. He brought in another guy who does more Middle Eastern music. So it was like, that's how people show up. So those are styles. Should I cover Reconstructionism very briefly? I love to, but Mordechai Kaplan, comes from the Lithuania. Mordechai Kaplan had a dapper beard, looked like Sigmund Freud, and he was very well educated. And he moves to New York, and he already had a very strong secular education in Lithuania. So he's a rationalist. And he walks into New York City, and what do you see in the 20s? But the Upper West Side is all the German Reform Jews. The Lower East Side is all the Eastern Orthodox Jews. And in the middle, also all these Zionists and Bundists and socialists, and they're all arguing about what is a Jew. We should be joining the revolution. No, we should be going to Israel. No, we should keep the old ways. And he says, you're all wrong. And remember, I talked about this. Judaism is a civilization, he says. And he came up with an idea, and that was the idea that Judaism is an evolving religious civilization. That's Kaplan. Today, as I said, I went to the Reconstruction. Folks, you know me by now. I was raised Reform by a Sephardic father and an Ashkenazic mother, right? So I had the Sephardic foods, right, that we went to Grandma's house for. And, Grandma and Grandpa would come out. They said exactly that. It's not my kind of Judaism, but look at all these young people. And I grew up in the classical Reform, watched it change, and I got tired of it. So I went Orthodox, the whole story. Not Chabad, but I followed the Orthodox. I learned a lot. I recommend it. Pablo's interested in that, but you learn from going to the traditional shuls. I decided on the Reconstructionist Seminary because they taught something different. Instead of, this is very important, you hear me talk this way, and sometimes people get alarmed. Moses didn't cause the Red Sea to part. And what if you don't believe that? So Kaplan said he wanted to say, this is, what can you believe in? And so today, all the movements have kind of accepted this idea of the periods, the phases of Jewish history. The Orthodox are still doing their thing. But if you look at it, all of them have evolved. Now, here's the story I told yesterday. Harold Schulweis, may he rest in peace, was my parents' rabbi. He was one of the conservative movement's great lights that didn't found, but he became the rabbi of Valley Beth Shalom in Encino, 2,000, 3,000 members. And but he was he was a Reconstructionist by education, but of course he would not leave the conservative movement, the liberal fringe, if you will, of the conservative movement. And he gave a lecture at a big conference. I was not there, but I heard the story. And another rabbi, Isaiah Zeldin, Cy Zeldin, was the founding rabbi of another huge synagogue in LA. I mean, this is just the LA stories, but it's great. If you ever go to LA, go up the 405, the San Diego Freeway, go to the right, and you'll see Stephen S. Wise Synagogue, named for Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, who was one of the founders of the Reform movement. So Cy Zeldin is at the conference, and he hears Harold Schulweis make a speech. He says, folks, I predict in about 50 years, the Reform movement and the conservative movement will realize they have to merge somehow, which is almost impossible to imagine today, but, because they have to survive. And so he comes down, and Shai Zeldin shakes his hand. He says, Harold, I agree with you, but it's going to take less than that. It's going to be 20 years. Well, it didn't happen, but the point is, I've got to conclude here. One of the things, I talked about this yesterday, there's three things I think that are meaningful in these movements. But my advice to any of you, Taylor, Herb, I talked to Herb. He goes to a synagogue where I used to be the rabbi in Downey, California. And the rabbi is an Argentinian rabbi, educated there in Buenos Aires, good friend of mine. And he runs the service conservative style, but the synagogue is Reform. It's almost like, French, German, Russian, Jewish, gay, straight. We're all just one big mishmash. But why do the movements still exist? One, money, institutionalism, raising the funds, keeping the structure. Where do you go to become a rabbi? You can go to independent, you can go to conservative, Reform, Orthodox, Hasidic. By the way, speaking professionally, just like medical schools, you can now go to rabbinical school online. I'm not sure I agree with it, but not entirely. But there are independent seminaries today. But in the old days, it was conservative, Reform, Orthodox. So there's a need for that. I mentioned Cincinnati, that particular school. They closed that school out of a need because they don't have enough students anymore. So the Reform synagogues Reform seminaries are New York or LA. So finances is taking a huge toll. The other reason, a second reason why the movements might still exist is style. Hebrew culture, a cantor who plays guitar, a cantor who doesn't allow instrumental music, the board, the rabbis, and this kind of traditionalism. So stylistically, if you go to BMHBJ in Denver, Beit Midrash, so that was a merger of two synagogues, a Reform and a conservative and Orthodox. So you go to Upper West Side, New York, you can go to a conservative shul that's very traditional, or a conservative shul that's very hip, laid back, groovy, but still traditional. So that style is a big question. The third question, which is very crucial, is, like I said before, where do we draw the line? Intermarriage? No. Rabbi can do this, rabbi can do that. Who's in charge? So I will be honest with you guys, the future of American Judaism looks good, but also not so good. Let's open up for comments, questions, arguments, debates. I'm going to say anybody, Herb, anybody who wants to share. You don't have to be, having grown up that way. But Jamie, you've been quiet. Jamie and Devin, who wants to throw something at me aside from a tomato?
Do you think that with the changes in the different movements,
Yes,
and some of those barriers are kind of going away, do you see that would create problems with Jewish identity in America?
yeah, it already has. It is. I mean, look at Mount Sinai. Well, I mean, that's one example because that's the Rocky Mountains. It's going to be different everywhere depending on the city. In LA, my friends, another friends from college, remember I founded this big old Jewish co-op, and like 20 of us lived together in a big old frat house. So Fran and Joel was a rabbi's son. Fran grew up conservative. They live in the Pico Robertson area. I'm talking about the LA stuff, but they live in an area where there's 20 delicatessens and synagogues, and they walk to shul. They're conservative Jews. They sit together, and the synagogue has the main service and a chavurah style service. So they keep a traditional lifestyle. And then about 10 minutes away is Rabbi Sharon Brous, who runs a group. She's the rabbi of a group called Ikar. Ikar is, I don't know if they're affiliated with the conservative movement, but for all intents and purposes, they are traditional. They will allow drums, or not drums, but, somebody playing a little, drum, the cantor, but no guitars, because they're conservative. But Sharon Brous is known as one of the most innovative, politically left rabbis of the U.S. Look her up, Sharon Brous. And so that's who they'll consult with. And so I don't know what to predict. There was a book. I was a big science fiction fan. I still am. But there was a short story book called Wandering Stars. I'm sorry, guys. I'm such a literature freak. But Wandering Stars was a collection of Jewish short stories, science fiction short stories, including by Isaac Asimov, who was Jewish. So one of the stories was called "How Will We Keep Kosher on Mars?" Look at that animal. What is that? Is that like a goat? Does it have blood? Is it like a mollusk? Is it so? It was a joke, of course, but I think part of our problem, this is to get into the next 2 weeks maybe, anti-Semitism is still there. It is rearing its ugly head. And looking at you guys, and Pablo and Darla are both converting together. Jamie and Devin are both converting together. But in your case, Sam, they used to say back in the day, intermarriage. Oh well, they got intermarried. I mean, that's why I asked you about your parents. Did they accept Emily? Your parents were pretty forward looking. But there was a time when people would say nobody wrote off my aunt, but my mom's sister married the athlete in college, Uncle Chet, and they moved to that area I mentioned before, Orange County, and they didn't do anything. So my two cousins, Eileen and Diane, have no Jewish identity. They know they're Jewish, so that began to change. So the Reform movement was the first movement to say, if what is it line? The line, if you can't beat them, join them. And they said, if you can't beat them, get them to join us. So the first changes began to happen with welcoming interfaith families. And I'm being asked that now in these interviews. What do you do about interfaith families? I've been doing intermarriages for 25 years. But I'm not, you guys remember, we don't proselytize, but I believe, frankly, Sam, one of the things that's going to save American Judaism is, how do I say this in a diplomatic fashion? Being more outgoing, right? And what do they say? In AA, they say, we don't promote, we just invite. I mean, Emily, you are the most Jewish woman I've met in a long time. Taylor, I love your spirituality. Jamie and Devin, they're excited about it. Pablo and Darla, Pablo is a Kabbalist, you know. Pablo, I wish you could meet the guy we have here, Josh Bandy. He studied, there's a guy in last year's class here who came into class knowing all the Kabbalah, and you know, we used to sit around and talk like this. So what's happening, frankly, this is maybe our salvation is, it used to be, you know, going back to maybe I don't even have to go back to the Russians or the Germans, even in America, you couldn't find a book on Judaism unless you were to go to a library. Now you can go to Barnes and Noble, Amazon, you know, go down the list. So, and you can just turn on Saturday Night Live, or you know, a good movie. And so we're out there. And as long as I mean, I'm starting to sound like a sociologist. As long as Israel is not destroyed, and real anti-Semitism, not the benign, you know, I mean, come on. I mean, a Nazi salute. Musk is an anti-Semite. So is Trump. Don't get me started. But we have not seen the kind of hatred in the
Rabbi.
Yeah.
Can we stick to the topic and stop with the Trump stuff, please?
I know. But all I was saying is that we have not seen in America the kinds of anti-Semitism they saw in Europe. So perhaps what's going to happen in America is that as long as Jews feel safe to be Jews, people will not be attracted. I'm not saying Christians will want to convert, but people will say, hey, that's cool, you know, or this is interesting. I mean, Devin, you're a great example. You are interested. So we don't agree on American politics, but we're simply saying there is an excitement about being Jewish that my grandparents didn't have. For them, it was a burden. And that's what I wanted to stress, the change. So go ahead, Devin, beat me up. Anything else you want to say? Not about politics, but what is your experience of Jewish identity, you guys, or in relation to the movements? Anybody? Herb?
Which movements are we talking about?
Any of them. Any of them. You like Chabad because it gave you a lot of the mysticism or the
it brought me closer to Adonai.
Yeah.
So it brought a deeper spiritualism for me with Chabad and the Kabbalah,
right?
Actually,
yeah.
So that's why I see a lot of things, like even when I know we're not supposed to be talking about Trump because some people get offended. However, Elon Musk did his little Hitler thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that was an autism thing. I mean, my daughter has autism and doesn't go around doing the Hitler thing.
Okay.
So
But in general,
I think that
you've been attracted to the traditional stuff, but when it comes to go to a synagogue with Darla, right now you're going to a reform place to get your feet wet.
right.
But you can go to all. That probably is the best answer for Sam. What is the future? I think the future is pan-denominational, and maybe just like you might go to a theater for this, or you'll go. I'm a musician. I'm sorry to get in here. I interrupted you, but I like the blues.
No, it's okay.
I like classical. I like jazz, and I like ethnic. So
Yeah,
get something different.
I'm the same way. Yes.
Yeah. Any other comments? Have I helped you to at least understand how we got from? Let's go all the way back to the biblical or the Greeks and the Romans and all that. But at least how we got out of the Dark Ages. Oi, they hate us because they think we killed their Messiah. To something they hate us because we're trying to make it.
I was gonna say, with the future of Judaism, like that happened in my own family where there were, we had some Sephardic Jews and then mostly Ashkenazi Jews, and somehow they just all died out with, conversions and all the stuff we talked about.
Wow. Huh.
And that's what I wanted to make sure when I found that out. It's like I just had this feeling in my heart, like it has to stop here. Like that can't happen
That's
with my family.
and
I feel like my kids have latched on to that.
Yes, write that into your
identity.
essay. I'm sorry.
Oh,
Just like Emily's working on hers, write that. I haven't given you your essay yet, but I think when you say that at the Beit Din, it will blow people's minds because that is not uncommon. But I don't run into that many people who have. I mean, you actually traced. This is not a DNA thing. You actually found families' documents. Fascinating.
Yep, on Ancestry.
Uh-huh.
And it was like almost a running joke. Like every day, my husband had come home. Did you find more Jewish ancestors today? Yeah.
Hey, I'm telling you, we're everywhere.
Yeah.
Devin, are you okay? Devin?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for hitting me.
I'm not hitting you. It's just
No.
it gets really old, man. This is about Judaism, not our politics right now.
I
This class
know.
is expensive.
I know.
And not just some of us are offended like some other people are saying. It's just this is really old. We go through this at work, at school, and everything.
I know. We're living.
Not
We're
everything's
living
about
through.
our politics.
I know. I'd say, yeah. Well, we're going through a polarizing time. But all right, let's end on a happy note. I have the story about we'll be kosher on Mars. So if you want to look up some of these people, I always say it, folks. I'm sorry I didn't play the movie because I don't want to play a movie when we can talk. And I hope I'm not boring you with this history stuff. This is stuff I've lived with. This is a period I've studied. I wouldn't want to live in it, be a German Jew or. Oh, by the way, just as a side note, meanwhile, while all this is happening in Germany and France and Russia, the Sephardic Jews, not poor, but the Mizrahi Jews living in Arab countries, it was still the Middle Ages. And then suddenly Israel is a state, and the Yemenite Jews are told, hey, get on a plane and go to Israel, and I'm not saying they were, living in caves, but it was a shock to the system. So Israel is a melting pot still of this Eastern and Western encounter. But look up a lot of these guys. You can learn a lot from the literature. So look up Isaac Bashevis Singer. And he was a scrawny little bald Yiddish man. I mean, he must have had hair at one time. When I met him, he was a guy, and they didn't even call him Singer because he had a brother named Singer who they called him Singer. Brother also wrote literature, so they called him Bashevis, which means Bat Sheva. So Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote a lot of the literature, not from the period of Shalom Aleichem. He wrote books of the in English, in Yiddish, and then translated to English about that culture. So he was an authority. And so they asked him, I'm going to imitate him, but not to make fun. They said, Rabbi, Mr. Singer, you're the great Yiddish writer. Is Yiddish a dying language? Because that's what they thought. And it's interesting. There is now, Yiddish is taught. I studied 2 years at UCLA. It's taught in many universities. So they asked him, okay, all right, Taylor. So they asked him, is Yiddish a dying language? He says, I missed it a lot. Is Yiddish a dying language? It's not dying. It may be a little sick, but it's not dying. So, all right. Good night, everybody. Thank you. Next week, I would like to meet in person at the synagogue if we can. Those of you who live in town, gotta let me know. If the weather's too bad, we won't. And I will send out the link for number 5 for that video. Watch the videos. Okay. Thank you, guys. Florida, I say goodbye to Florida and goodbye to LA. I love you guys.
Good night, Rabbi.
All right.
Good night, everybody.
All right. Buenas noches.